Welcome to Dear SQL DBA. I'm Kendra Little. In Dear SQL DBA, I answer questions about being a SQL Server DBA or working or living with one. And you can catch Dear SQL DBA on iTunes, Google Play, or YouTube. So this week, our question is about troubleshooting performance. Here's the question. Dear SQL DBA, is there any step-by-step script that you would use to start troubleshooting? My production SQL Server has a problem with memory pressure. Page life expectancy is low, and lazy writes are high. I've heard that Microsoft engineers will use SQL Diag and then Nexus to troubleshoot, but I have not had success using those tools. Sincerely, lost in performance troubleshooting. So you need a strategy to troubleshoot performance. And I realize lost in performance troubleshooting. I realize that you asked for a step-by-step script. I'm going to give you something a little different. I'm going to give you a strategy that isn't specific to a single script. And then I'm going to talk about free tools that fit into that strategy. And I think this is actually better for you in the long run because this is actually really great news. We are getting cool new options to help troubleshoot performance in new versions of SQL Server. SQL Server 2016 has introduced the query store, which we recently learned is actually going to be available in all editions of SQL Server. So you don't have to have expensive edition to get this. And that is the most exciting thing to come to SQL Server, I think, in my opinion, since SQL Server 2005. So you want to have an overall strategy and then fit the tools into your strategy depending on the version of SQL Server that you're working with. So here is my strategy for troubleshooting performance. When things are slow, there are really three things that I want to make sure that I cover before making an assessment of really kind of what direction I'm going in and where I think the root cause lies. The first thing, I want to know when it's slow, I want to take a sample and say, okay, in this instant, what queries are running? And for those queries, how long have they been running? And what are they waiting on? And when things are slow, I'll take repeat samples of that. Just for a single moment in time, what's running? How long has it been running? And what is it waiting on? And, you can find really different things, depending on the nature of the problem. Sometimes things are slow and you say, what's running? And you don't see anything. This might be because a lot of things are running and they're finishing really fast. Or it might actually be that not much is running and the application actually, when it occasionally, it's not constantly talking to the SQL Server. It's just that when it does, it's slow, right? So sometimes you see that there are some things that are taking a really long time, but you get really critical information and a lot of information just from taking this sample. And you want a script or a tool that'll let you see, how long the things have been going and what are their wait stats. Now, the second thing I want to know is when things are slow, for a given time interval, what are the SQL Server wait statistics for that time interval? Say for 30 seconds or for 60 seconds, what were the waits in that period? And I talked about waits in item number 1 too. In item number 1, I wanted to know what are the, for the queries that are running, what are they waiting on? I also want to know that just for the SQL Server in general. And this is actually important to collect both. Now, first of all, there are some waits that you'll never see on queries that are running because there are some waits that only happen when a query isn't running, like it's waiting on perhaps a memory grant and it hasn't gotten one yet. It isn't yet executing, or it is waiting on a CPU resource. It actually can't get a scheduler to be on. These waits may not, some of them will, some of them won't, show up on the query itself. And so taking that server level sample helps you see that. Also, remember how I said, sometimes you could look at, hey, what's running right at this instant, and you might not see anything. It might be because so many little queries are finishing fast that you can't see them in that instant. But when you look at, say, the 30 or 60 second sample, that gives you a way of knowing what are the weights across the whole SQL Server itself, and you can see it for all the activity that's happening in that period, which is really, really useful, right? So I want to know not only what are the weights for the queries that are running, but also what are the weights for a time period on the SQL Server itself. Those are the first two items I want to know in my strategy. And then the third item is kind of a big one. I always want to make sure if I'm troubleshooting performance that I do a sanity check to see, could I be missing something obvious on the SQL Server instance? And this is kind of like doing a really quick health check of the whole instance, because in the past, I may have jumped to conclusions. There could be messages in the SQL Server error log that completely change your perspective, for instance. It might be that things are really slow on the SQL Server instance at times, like periodically, and you look in the SQL Server log and you see, hey, there are messages here that indicate the SQL Server is stack dumping, and it's just that things seem slow because when it stack dumps, it's actually seizing up and looking at itself and figuring out what's wrong with me, right? And so we don't want to look at like query execution plans. We really want to look at what is up with this stack dump and figure out that. Or we might see information about failed logins or corruption or other, last time CheckDB ran, it found corruption, that kind of thing, that really change our perspective. We also need to make sure that we don't have a database setting that could be causing the poor performance. Like maybe the database auto shrink setting is on and it's periodically shrinking the database, which not only uses resources, but shrinking and moving stuff around can actually cause lock weights and blocking. We want to look at the SQL Server settings and say, do we have everything right here? I've found cases where the SQL Server, the server or the virtual machine had a lot of memory, but the max server memory setting was really, really low for some reason in the SQL Server setting, so it couldn't even use that. The Windows Windows event log is also important to look at as well. We could have power problems or failing RAM or different hardware issues that are called out in the Windows log. So I've learned, if I'm troubleshooting a performance issue, to not just assume that it's indexes or query plans. There's certainly a lot of problems that can happen there, but to make sure to do kind of a kicking of the tires and a check of the bigger picture to say, is there something obvious? I want to make sure, if there is, that I catch it. But 2 out of the 3 steps, you may notice, involved weight statistics in SQL Server. When I'm looking at what queries are running, and the big thing I want to know for time periods when things are slow on the server itself is weight statistics. And the reason that weight statistics are so critical is that weight stats are SQL Server's way of explaining what is dragging things down or what literally are queries waiting on to finish. So when your question is about performance, that's really critical. Another way to look at them also, though, is weight stats are an extremely useful thing to baseline so that you know what is normal on your system. It may be that it's perfectly normal for my system to wait a certain amount on reading things from disk or writing things to the transaction log. If I regularly sample weight statistics, I have the ability, when things are slow, to look at a sample of those and say, okay, well, yeah, I have some weights, but I actually know that the particular weights that I see and the amount of them that I see over this period is actually pretty normal, and this isn't unusual. When you see that, it doesn't mean things aren't slow. You know there's if users are telling you, hey, there's a performance issue, or you're getting messages from the application that queries are slow. Yes, those queries are slow, but it tells you, hey, the server isn't having more weights than usual, that's a good indication that the server resources aren't bottlenecking and causing the queries to be slow, that instead you need to be saying, okay, what execution plans are my queries getting and how are they optimizing out? Because there's some sort of way that the queries are being slow, and it's not just that it can't get the resources from the server, because those are normal, right? So that's extremely useful. And there's also the fact that when you look at these weights on a regular basis and you know what's normal for your server, when things are slow, sometimes you look at the weights when things are slow and something jumps out at you because you either have way more of a weight than usual or weight types that aren't usual. And you're like, oh, what is this, specific weight type that I don't see? And why is it happening now? What queries are associated with that weight or might cause that weight? That gives you a really clear direction to go in as well. So this is extremely, extremely useful. The main reason that a lot of folks don't use weight stats and that this strategy isn't sort of more accessible and more widely used is simply that there is a real learning curve for weight stats and getting used to dealing with, okay, well, here is this sort of encoded weight, learning what it means and learning what's normal and not normal. Also, learning which weights are ignorable because it's just stuff that happens. That has a real learning curve to it. So not everyone, takes to it right away. Sometimes people are in the middle of a performance crisis and they're just like, I don't have time to look all this stuff up. That is totally understandable. What it really means is you should get used to working with these on a regular basis so that when you're in a performance crisis, you're already familiar with it and you're equipped to handle this with what I think are really the best tools to help you with a performance problem, which is weight stats. So given lost in performance troubleshooting's example, where I'm guessing you've used performance counters lost to kind of say, because you're saying my page life expectancy is low, SQL Server exposes a performance counter for that, and my lazy writes are high. What would that look like if you were looking at weight statistics in SQL Server? Well, I would expect if you were looking in weight statistics, I would probably see that over the sampled time period when things are slow, that you have page IO latch weights. Now, there are similar weights that are just like page latch, but the one that I'm thinking of is page IO latch. There's an underscore at the end and it has different subtypes. In this case, I wouldn't worry about the subtypes. What page IO latch means is I am having to access storage a lot and populate, go out, get stuff from storage and put it in memory. The page life expectancy counter is really an indicator. It's an estimate of how long can I keep pages in the data cache of SQL Server, also known as the buffer pool. So like the data from a table, keep a copy of that, or an index, keep a copy of that in memory. When page life expectancy is low, it means I'm having to read a lot of stuff. I'm having a lot of churn in memory, which indicates that you're doing a lot of storage access to kind of populate that stuff in memory. So I would expect to see page IO latch weights. And what's really helpful about the weight stats is you can see, okay, well, how many of the weights were there over the period? And then how long was it waiting? Depending on what your storage is, this may have more or less of an impact on your queries, because if your storage is slow, hey, then you may be waiting a relatively really long time to get that stuff. But if your storage is really fast and getting it back is really quick, it may have less of an impact on your queries, right? So it gives you kind of a richer source of information in terms of what are your queries waiting on. You might also see, I don't know, but it's possible, if you're seeing a lot of memory churn, you might see that LCK weights or lock weights have something to do with this. Sometimes when queries are blocking one another, you can get a big blocking chain and it can create a backlog of queries. And then as the locking issue gets worked out, sometimes we have, in that case now, more queries running at once. After the locking clears, they're all trying to put new data into memory and they're fighting over memory, and we have a big churn. And maybe what we need to focus on in that case is really, okay, well, why are we having the locking issue? You might also see, and again, could be, could not be, that you have these resource semaphore weights. And resource semaphore are ones, with the tool I'm going to talk about later, you actually can see which queries are waiting on resource semaphore, even though they haven't technically been able to start executing yet. Resource semaphore wait on a query means my query is trying to get query workspace memory. And this is the type of memory that's used for parallelism or sorts or joins that the query needs to process. If you have a lot of queries running who all need a lot of this kind of memory, depending on the amount of memory you have and how your SQL Server is set up, new queries may actually say, oh, I actually can't get enough memory to do the sorts and the joins and all the stuff I need to do. So I'm going to actually wait before I even get started until I can get this workspace memory. And in certain memory pressure situations on your SQL Server, this could show up, and it feels super slow to the users because the queries literally can't even get started. But that's a very different direction to go than if it's a locking problem or, that kind of thing. So the wait stats really help point you in a direction and give you a place to go. Now, you may or may not be able to sit at your computer all the time watching your SQL Server. I hope that you don't do that. A natural question is, what if I can't see the performance problem when it's happening? We all have meetings or cups of coffee that we need to drink, and that's normal. And like I said, also, you want to have a regular collection of wait stats and sampling of queries that run because you want to know what's normal for your SQL Server. There are a lot of great specialized SQL Server performance monitoring tools out there that what they do is say, hey, we've refined our methods to, in a really lightweight way, collect wait statistics and query runtime, or query execution information from your SQL Server so that if it was slow at 2:42 a.m., you don't have to be awake at 2:42 a.m. You can go back in our monitoring tool and kind of look at what was running, how long had it been running, what are the wait stats, what are the server's overall wait stats, right? It wants to give you that information, which is great. But if you can't buy those monitoring tools, there are a lot of free tools that you can fit into this strategy that I've outlined. The first free tool that I think is worth looking at is a wait statistics reference that has been published by Paul Randall. He has published a SQL Server wait library on the SQL Skills website. So you'd search Paul Randall, SQL Server wait library, and you'd get to the SQL Skills website. And this is fantastic because, like I said, decoding these wait stats is one of the hardest parts. So you can sample wait statistics on your SQL Server and look up, hey, what is this wait type all about? And he has documented many different wait types on there for you to look at. So that's fantastic. What about just looking at, hey, what's running, what's happening right now? That's the very first thing I said I would look at. Adam Mechanic has written a stored procedure called SP who is active. It's SP_who is active. And it is fantastic. It's totally free for checking and saying what's running, how long has it been running, and what is it waiting on. You can also tell it using parameters, hey, I'd like to get the execution plans for what's running. There is also an option using the parameters to log that information to a table. So you could have regular sampling what's running and dump it into a table. I do know from experience that you can easily fill up a database if you're collecting execution plans into a table. That's not Adam's fault. Execution plans are stored in XML, and it turns out that XML can take up a lot of room, right? So you need to make sure that you don't fill up the hard drives on your SQL Server. That's up to you. But SP Who is Active is a fantastic tool. Search for SP Who is Active and SQL Blog. It's on SQLblog.com is where Adam has the downloads for that awesome free stored procedure. What about collecting weights for a given time period? Well, I've got 2 scripts that I think you should try out, look at, and see which one you want. And I encourage you also to look at the scripts and notice that what these scripts do is they do exclude a lot of weights which are benign weights. There are weights that SQL Server emits that just mean, hey, I'm running properly. I'm waiting for something to happen, and that's normal. You don't need to worry about those weight types, and these scripts exclude the weights that don't need to concern you. Paul Randall, who wrote the weight library, he has a script for this on the SQL Skills blog. Search for Paul Randall capturing weight statistics, and you'll find his script on the SQL Skills site. Brent Ozar also has a great script for this on the Brent Ozar Unlimited site. It is called SP_Ask Brent. So search for Ask Brent to get that one. They both let you do, hey, I want to see the weights for a given period of time on this SQL Server. Now, finally, the sanity check. Am I missing something obvious? Is there messages in the system tables indicating there's corruption and all sorts of, rule out kind of the scary stuff. Got 2 options for these. Again, you want to make sure that you're familiar with the output because you can get a lot of output from both of these, and you want to make sure that you're not struggling to learn how to read the output, when you're running the scripts. Brent Ozar Unlimited has a free script called SP Blitz. It's SP_Blitz that does a quick check of the SQL Server and looks for problematic configurations at the server and database level. Search for SP Blitz for that. And Glenn Barry from SQL Skills has a set of diagnostic information queries, and he has sets for different versions of SQL Server. He also provides specialized Excel sheets for each version of the script so that you can save them off in Excel on different tabs. And he's got it all set up for you. Search for Glenn Barry diagnostic queries, and you will find Glenn's DMV queries. So try those out, see which one you like, and make sure that you've kind of got a handle on how your instances are configured, and make sure that's all set before you get there. Now, always know that something could, even if I checked my SQL Server 2 months ago, things may have changed since then if I have a performance problem today. Maybe I changed a setting before I released some code and forgot to change it back, right? Don't necessarily think someone else has been messing with your SQL Server, but we all have times where, oops, we forgot to reset that, and then it comes back and haunts us if we don't do a quick check over when things go bad. Now, I mentioned earlier that I think things are changing and that we need to be open to fitting new tools into this strategy. This is a really exciting thing about SQL Server 2016 with the query store feature. Now, the query store is awesome, but it doesn't do everything. The query store does not collect weight statistics yet at this time. I have hopes and dreams that maybe we'll have a weight store in the future, but I don't have any information on that. And I've said that weights are really critical, but the query store still does things that are really cool because you can tell SQL Server, if you enable query store for a database, you can tell it, hey, keep an eye on what's running and capture what queries are running, how long they're taking, and what their execution plans are. This is really, really awesome because it actually will also back up with the database itself. So if I'm starting to have performance problems and I'm using query store, which, be careful turning it on. We can manage to break things with just about anything. But if I'm using query store, I can restore that backup to a totally different environment. And the team troubleshooting doesn't have to have access to production. And using query store in the restored database, they can see what was running, how long was it taking, and the query execution plans for those. I do still think weight information is critical and that you want to be capturing that in production and that it's essential information for those folks troubleshooting to have. But that's a lot easier than capturing weight information and all the query information, and you're not going to get all the query information either with just samples, right? So query store is a fantastic tool for capturing query execution metrics and information. You still will want to capture that weight information to supplement it, but I think it fits right into this strategy and gives us more options as SQL Server changes to start troubleshooting performance more effectively, more confidently, and with more and more information. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Dear SQL DBA. I'll see you again soon.